"I'm sorry, but this table has already been reserved for another party." Have you ever made a reservation weeks in advance, shown up on time, dressed well, done everything right, and still been told the table wasn't yours? Julian Mercer had not even reached the host stand when he heard it. The voice belonged to a woman in a tailored black blazer, standing near the entrance of Ardor, one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago. Her name was Courtney Slade, 38, front-of-house manager, the kind of person who had spent years learning to read a room and had, somewhere along the way, confused confidence with accuracy. She was speaking to the couple behind Julian, and yet her eyes had already moved past them, past everyone, and landed on him. Julian was 41. He wore dark slacks, a grey Henley, and clean leather shoes with no visible logo. No tie, no pocket square, no visible signal that he was anything other than a man who had wandered in from a Tuesday afternoon without an appointment. He carried nothing but a phone and a slim card holder tucked into his front pocket. No assistant, no entourage, no one to announce him. He had not eaten since 6 that morning. He had flown in from Seattle, sat through 4 hours of infrastructure meetings, and turned down an invitation to a rooftop dinner with 3 venture capital partners, specifically because he had wanted one quiet meal alone before tomorrow's board presentation. He had booked table 14, corner window, city view, enough distance from the bar to think, 42 days in advance. Julian stepped up to the host stand. A younger host, barely 25, looked up with a practiced smile. "Welcome to Ardor. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Julian said. "Mercer. Party of 1. The young man typed. His fingers slowed. He looked at the screen for a moment longer than necessary. Before he could speak, Courtney Slade appeared at his shoulder. She had the smooth, rehearsed energy of someone who managed problems before they became inconvenient. Her eyes moved over Julian quickly. The Henley, the card holder, the absence of a jacket. "Mr. Mercer?" she said, her voice pleasantly cool. "That's right," she smiled. "I see your reservation here. Unfortunately, we had a small system issue this afternoon and your table was reassigned as part of a private dining arrangement." She paused. "We do have availability at the bar, and we'd be happy to offer you a complimentary appetizer for the inconvenience." Julian looked at her, not with anger, not with surprise, with the particular stillness of a man who had been told this kind of lie before and recognized it on sight. "What's the name on the private arrangement?" he asked. Courtney blinked. "I'm sorry. The party that was given my table. What name is it under?" A pause. Brief but visible. "I'm not able to share that information." Julian nodded slowly. "Is it because there's a privacy concern?" he said. "Or because there isn't actually another party?" The young host behind the stand stared at his screen. Courtney's smile did not disappear. It simply became less warm. "Mr. Mercer, I understand this is frustrating. The bar seating is extremely comfortable, and Chef Arnaud actually prefers those guests for his tasting menus." "I didn't book a bar seat," Julian said. "I booked table 14. I booked it 6 weeks ago. I have the confirmation number." "Systems do sometimes. Show me the system error." The sentence was quiet, specific. The kind of request that only someone who understood systems would think to make. Courtney's jaw tightened by a fraction. "I'm not sure if there was a system issue that reassigned my reservation. There would be a record of the reassignment, a timestamp, an error code. Show me that, and I'll happily sit at the bar." Behind Julian, a couple had paused near the entrance, listening with the careful attention people give to situations they recognize, don't know how to name. An older man at the nearest table had lowered his fork. Courtney leaned slightly toward the young host and murmured something. He typed. She read the screen. Something moved across her face, fast and controlled, the way a person looks when they find exactly what they hoped wasn't there. Table 14. Mercer. Party of 1, 7 p.m. Confirmed. No reassignment, no system flag, no error timestamp. She straightened. "Mr. Mercer, I do apologize. There may have been some miscommunication on our end. Her voice had shifted, slightly warmer, slightly more careful. If you'll give us just a few moments to prepare your table. How long? 10 minutes, perhaps 15. Julian looked at his watch. 7:04. I'll wait, he said, and he stepped to the side, said nothing further, and looked out toward the city through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. That should have been the end of it. It was not. At 7:09, a man walked through Ardor's front entrance, the way certain men walked into rooms, as if the architecture had been arranged in anticipation of his arrival. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, heavy in the shoulders, the kind of tan that came from boats rather than beaches. He wore a sport coat that cost more than most people's rent, and he was already laughing at something his companion had said before the door fully closed behind them. His name was Harold Fitch, 56, commercial real estate developer, a man who had been dining at Ardor for 11 years, and who had at some point confused loyalty with ownership. Courtney Slade materialized at his side within seconds. "Mr. Fitch," she said, and this time her smile was entirely different, genuine, reflexive. "So wonderful to see you. Your table is ready." Harold Fitch glanced around the room with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been asked to sit at the bar. His eyes landed briefly on Julian, standing near the window, registered him, moved on. "Table 14? Harold asked. "Of course," Courtney said. Julian turned. He had heard the number. He had also heard the way she said, "Of course," without hesitation, without apology, as if the question were routine. He walked back to the host stand. "That's my table," he said. Courtney turned. Her composure had the quality of lacquer over particle board. "Mr. Mercer, I've already explained. You told me there was a system error. You told me my table was reassigned as part of a private arrangement." Julian's voice stayed level. "Now I'm watching you walk another guest to that same table. So one of those things isn't true." Harold Fitch had stopped moving. His companion, a younger woman in a silk blouse, put a hand on his arm. Courtney lowered her voice. "Mr. Mercer, please. This isn't the place." "You chose the place," Julian said, "when you decided to give my reservation away in front of me." A waiter near the service station had gone very still. A busser who had been clearing a two-top pretended to inspect a wine glass. Harold Fitch turned fully now, assessing. His eyes moved over Julian the same way Courtney's had. The grey Henley, the absence of a jacket, the card holder with no visible brand. He made a quiet calculation and came to a quiet conclusion. "Is there a problem?" Harold asked, addressing Courtney rather than Julian. "No problem," Courtney said quickly. "There is actually," Julian said, and he said it to Harold directly, calmly. "That's my table. I reserved it 6 weeks ago. I have the confirmation." Harold's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. The specific impatience of a man who was accustomed to friction resolving itself the moment he walked into a room. "I'm sure the staff can find you something," Harold said. His voice carried the perfectly calibrated dismissal of someone who had never needed to raise it. Julian looked at him. "I'm sure they can," he said. "But what they can't do is give you what belongs to me." The silence in the immediate vicinity was particular. The kind that happens when everyone within earshot understands that something significant is occurring. But no one is certain yet which direction it will turn. Courtney stepped between them. "Mr. Mercer, I want to make this right. We have a lovely two-top near the wine cellar that just opened up. You've now offered me the bar and a two-top," Julian said. "The reservation I made was for table 14. That's the only resolution I'm interested in." Harold made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff, something in between. "You know what I like about this place," he said to no one in particular. "The service used to be impeccable." He meant it as an ending, a dismissal with an audience. Julian did not react to it. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Harold Fitch, a man who knew he was being dismissed and said nothing, not from shame, but from something that looked more like patience. was a different kind of man. Harold had spent decades reading people. He was suddenly not certain he was reading this one correctly. Courtney tried again. "Mr. Mercer, I can have the general manager come speak with you if you'd prefer." "Yes," Julian said. "Please." She had offered it expecting him to decline. His agreement caught her off guard. She reached for her earpiece. The general manager arrived in 4 minutes. His name was Thomas Aldridge, 52, general manager of Ardor. For 6 years, the kind of man who ran a great restaurant the way a good conductor ran an orchestra, through presence, precision, and the ability to hear when something was wrong before it became audible to anyone else. He had already been briefed, in about 30 seconds, by Courtney, whose version of events had the shape of all versions told by people who knew they had done something indefensible. He walked toward the host stand with the careful neutrality of a man trying to assess which fire to put out first. He looked at Julian, then at Harold Fitch, then at the young host, who had the expression of someone who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. "Mr. Mercer," Thomas said. "I'm Thomas Aldridge. I apologize for any confusion tonight." "It's not a confusion," Julian said. "I have a confirmed reservation for table 14. That table was offered to another guest after I arrived." Thomas looked at the screen. His face gave very little away, but his shoulders dropped a half-inch. He had seen it, the timestamp, the confirmation, the lack of any legitimate reason for the reassignment. "You're correct," Thomas said, "and I apologize." Harold made a sound from beside him. "Thomas?" Thomas turned. The politeness in his face was genuine, but so was the fatigue behind it. "Mr. Fitch, I'm afraid there's been an error on our part. We'll have you set up at table 9, which I believe you've enjoyed before. Full comp on the first course for the inconvenience." Harold's expression cycled through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, offense. The slow recalibration of a man who had expected the equation to resolve in his favor. "You're giving him 14? Harold said. "It was reserved by him," Thomas said. "6 weeks ago. I have been coming here for 11 years. I know that, and we value it." "But a confirmed reservation. Courtney told me the table was available." Thomas's eyes moved briefly to Courtney, who looked at the floor. "That was an error in judgment," Thomas said, "and I'll address it. But it doesn't change the fact that the reservation belongs to Mr. Mercer." Harold turned toward Julian with the full attention of a man who had decided a situation required direct engagement. "Listen," Harold said, his voice carrying the careful warmth of a man who was accustomed to winning people over. "I've got a business dinner, a real one. I'm not trying to cause a scene, but this place has been my table for a long time. And that's not a reservation," Julian said quietly. Harold stopped. "Having a favorite table isn't the same as having a reservation," Julian continued. "I made mine 42 days ago. I confirmed it twice. I showed up on time." He looked at Harold without anger, without hostility, just with the flat and certain steadiness of someone who had said true things in difficult rooms many times before. "I don't know what arrangement you've had with this restaurant, but it doesn't supersede a documented booking." Harold stared at him. The older man at the nearby table had set down his glass. A woman near the bar had turned on her bar stool. "Do you know who I am?" Harold asked. The question landed with all the weight he intended it to carry. Julian tilted his head very slightly. Should that matter? The question was gentle, it was also devastating. Harold opened his mouth. Nothing came out because the honest answer, the only honest answer, was no. No, it should not matter. And in the act of asking the question, Julian had exposed the premise underneath Harold's entire approach to the evening. Thomas Aldridge stepped forward. "Mr. Fitch, I'll personally see to table 9. I'll also arrange for Chef Arnaud to send over the autumn tasting menu as our compliment." He looked at Julian. "Mr. Mercer, table 14 is yours. I'll have the server with you in 2 minutes." Harold Fitch said nothing more. He turned and walked toward table 9 with his companion, who had not spoken once during the entire exchange, and now wore the expression of someone who had watched something she would think about for a while. Julian followed a host to table 14, the corner window, the city view, the table he had reserved 42 days ago. He sat down, placed his phone face down on the linen, and looked out at Chicago in the early dark. The river was silver below. The buildings held their lights like something permanent. He thought about ordering the lamb, and then Thomas Aldridge appeared beside the table, not with a menu, but with a quieter energy. He pulled out the chair across from Julian slightly, not sitting, just a gesture of presence, and spoke low enough that it stayed between them. "Mr. Mercer, I want to be honest with you about what happened tonight." Julian looked up. "Courtney knew your table was taken when she offered it to Mr. Fitch. It wasn't a system error. It wasn't a miscommunication. Mr. Fitch has an informal arrangement that predates my tenure here, and some of the staff have honored it without question for years." Thomas paused. "That ends tonight." Julian held his gaze. "What made you say that to me?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Because when I walked up and you said it's not a confusion, you were right, and I knew it. And I almost said something different anyway." He looked down briefly. "I don't want to be that kind of general manager." Julian studied him. The admission had cost something, he could see that. "I appreciate it," Julian said, and he meant it. Thomas nodded and stepped back. "Your server will be right over. The lamb is excellent tonight." Julian almost smiled. After Thomas left, Julian reached for his phone. Not to scroll, not to post. He opened a message thread labeled Mercer Capital. Internal, and typed 4 words, "Push tomorrow's call back." He set the phone down again and looked at the window. He had not told Thomas Aldridge who he was. He had not produced a card. He had not mentioned that Mercer Capital managed $11 billion in hospitality and real estate investment across 14 cities, including 3 properties within 4 blocks of where he was currently sitting. He had not mentioned that his firm's analysts had been quietly evaluating Ardor's parent group for a potential acquisition for the better part of the past quarter. He had not mentioned any of it, because none of it should have been necessary. The server came. Julian ordered the lamb and a glass of the 19 Barolo. The server left. The restaurant continued around him. Conversations and candlelight, and the soft percussion of a kitchen running at full speed, and Julian Mercer sat in the window seat he had reserved 42 days earlier, and simply existed in it, as was his right, as it had always been his right, before anyone knew his name. But someone did look him up, as someone always eventually did. It was the young host, the one who had gone still behind the stand, the one who had typed and seen the truth on the screen before anyone said a word. His name was Andrew, 24, 3 months into the job, still learning what the job actually required of him. After Julian was seated, Andrew did what people his age did when something didn't add up. He searched the name, Julian Mercer, Chicago, Mercer Capital. The results loaded in under 2 seconds. Andrew stared at his phone under the host stand for a long moment. Then he looked at table 14. Then at table 9, where Harold Fitch was finishing his first course with the careful enjoyment of a man trying to look unbothered. Andrew looked back at his phone. He thought about the moment Courtney had read the confirmation screen and still said, "If you'll give us just a few moments." He thought about the way Harold Fitch had said, "I'm sure the staff can find you something, not to resolve the situation, but to end it." He thought about himself, standing there saying nothing, searching for a script that didn't exist. He put his phone away. He did not tell anyone what he had found, not because it wasn't significant, but because he was beginning to understand that it shouldn't have been what made the difference. At 8:40, Harold Fitch's Table 9 experience ended. He signed the check. The first course had been comped, but he insisted on paying for the remainder, a point of pride that no longer meant what he thought it did, and stood to leave. He buttoned his sport coat slowly, the way men did when they were assembling themselves after something had not gone the way they expected. He passed table 14 on the way out. He stopped. Julian was finishing the last of the Barolo. The lamb plate had been cleared. He had his phone open now, not scrolling, reading something long and dense, the kind of document that required both eyes. Harold looked at him for a moment. Julian did not look up, and then Harold said, quietly enough that only the nearby tables might have caught it, "I'll admit I was wrong about you." Julian looked up then. Harold's face held something unfamiliar to it. Not apology, exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man who had been confronted with his own assumption and found it lacking. "I don't know who you are," Harold said, "and that's not something I say often." Julian set his phone down. He looked at Harold Fitch the way he had looked at him all evening, without anger, without triumph, without any trace of the drama Harold might have expected from the situation. "I know," Julian said. Harold seemed to be waiting for something more, a name, a credential, something that would let him organize the evening into a story that made sense. Julian did not give it to him. "Good night," Julian said. Harold Fitch stood there another second. Then he nodded once, a small odd gesture, more acknowledgement than courtesy, and walked toward the exit. The woman in the silk blouse followed him. At the door, she glanced back at Julian, just briefly. Her expression was not difficult to read. She had watched a man defend what was his without raising his voice, without producing credentials, without performing a single thing for any audience. She had watched him simply be right, quietly, and wait for the world to catch up. She turned and walked through the door. Courtney Slade spent the remainder of her shift at the back of house. Thomas Aldridge had not dismissed her, not yet, but the conversation they had was the kind that changed what came after it. She had said she was trying to keep a good customer happy. Thomas had said there was no version of that which required giving away someone else's reservation. To do it, she had said she'd made a judgment call. He had said some judgment calls reveal more than we intend them to. She had not answered that. At 9:15, Julian folded his napkin, placed it to the left of his glass, and checked the time. He had a 6 a.m. flight, a full day of presentations, and a deal in progress that would determine the investment strategy of a fund that affected more people than most would guess. He was tired in the way that ran deeper than sleep could fix, the fatigue of a man who spent a great deal of time being underestimated and had decided long ago not to expend energy being angry about it. He pulled out the slim card holder and left $200 on the table, 80% tip, not to make a point, but because the server had been excellent and the server had done nothing wrong. He stood, he put on his jacket. He walked toward the exit. Thomas Aldridge intercepted him near the host stand. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for your patience tonight." Julian paused. "Thank you for getting it right," he said. "Eventually." The words landed gently. Thomas absorbed it. "I hope we'll see you again," Thomas said. Julian looked around Ardor. The candlelight, the service, the city through the glass, the corner table where he had sat undisturbed for 2 hours in the quiet he had come here for, and made no promise. He walked through the door. Out on the sidewalk, Chicago was fully dark and fully alive. Cabs moved in yellow streaks. A couple argued softly on the corner. The river reflected the lights of the bridges like something patient and indifferent to all the small emergencies of the evening. Julian Mercer pulled his jacket closed and walked toward his hotel. Somewhere behind him, Andrew the host stood at the stand, with his hands folded in front of him, and thought about what he had and had not done that evening. He thought about the moment the screen had shown him the truth, and he had stayed silent, while Courtney did something with it that she shouldn't have. He thought about what it would cost him, professionally, to have spoken up. And then he thought about what it had cost Julian Mercer, a man who had done nothing wrong, who had simply wanted the table he had earned, to have to argue for it in front of a room full of strangers. Andrew thought the math on that was not close. He had been in this job 3 months. He hoped, if it happened again, He would do something with what he knew. Some lessons arrive without a name attached. Some things you learn to do right only after you've watched someone else pay the price for you doing it wrong. That night, table 14 sat empty after Julian left, and it stayed that way for the rest of service. Nobody asked for it. Nobody was offered it. It just sat in the corner window, with the city lights behind it, cleaned and set and waiting, as if it understood that it had, for one evening, meant more than a table usually does.